All right, let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're calling in from today, and welcome to the launch of the INEE Charlevoix Funding Dashboard. We are grateful to have you with us today to launch this exciting new resource. My name is Lauren Gherkin. I'm the INEE Gender Coordinator, and I will be your moderator for today. So before we get started, I'd like to just go over a few quick housekeeping points. So for security reasons, your audio and video have been disabled, but you can still actively participate through the chat and Q&A functions. You are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A at any time. Just click on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen to access it, and we will do our best to save some time towards the end of the webinar to address any questions that you have. Closed captioning is also available for this webinar. You can turn it on by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded, and the recording and presentation slides will be shared on the INEE website and with all registrants by email. We highly encourage you to share the recording and the dashboard with your friends and colleagues. So let's get started. We have a number of incredible speakers for you today, representing a range of Charlevoix donors, funding partners, and implementing partners who we will be introducing throughout the webinar. But before we dive into the dashboard itself, I'd like to hand over to Louise Holt, Director General for Social Development at Global Affairs Canada, for some opening remarks. Over to you, Louise.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren, and welcome everybody. As Lauren said, my name is Louise Holt with Global Affairs Canada. I am so pleased to welcome everybody here today and to be participating with such a great panel of speakers, as Lauren said. This is really exciting for us to be at this point of launching the Charlevoix Funding Dashboard. And I do want to thank, as I start, the INEE Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies and the Reference Group on Girls' Education and Emergencies for your leadership on this initiative and in girls' education more broadly. Before I start, let me just acknowledge where I'm speaking to you from. I am coming to you today from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'd like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to work and live on this beautiful land, which if you haven't been here, I hope all of you will have a chance to visit someday. It's also known as the National Capital Region near Ottawa, Canada's capital city. So just let me step back a little bit. I want to talk to a couple of points. Bear with me for a moment because I know I want to get around to the issue of accountability, but let me first step back. So I think most people know that this initiative goes back to the 2018 Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education for Girls, Adolescent Girls, and Women in Developing Countries. And at the G7 Charlevoix Summit, G7 countries, but more than just G7 countries, a number of partners joined, that many around the table today, joined in making it a really historic commitment to making education a priority within the development and humanitarian nexus, and underscoring the importance of education, particularly education for forcibly displaced, conflict and crisis affected girls and women, if we're to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So we, of course, are proud that that happened on the margins of the Canada's G7 Summit, Charlevoix Declaration. But it was really all of the efforts of everybody else joining in that resulted in the $4.3 billion Canadian that was committed by donors and funding partners for this initiative. I want to highlight again that an important element of that commitment was engaging adolescents and adolescent girls in particular. And since Charlevoix, I think I personally, not a scientific analysis, but I really think we've seen an increase, a significant increase in engagement of youth, of adolescents. We see it from the recent climate summit. We've seen it in the expression of colleagues like the Pascal from the Netherlands having permanent youth ambassadors representing them. For our part, last year in Canada, we launched the Together for Learning campaign to promote quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for refugees and IDP children and youth. And as part of that campaign, we made a conscious effort to involve multiple stakeholders, but importantly, refugees themselves and refugee youth representatives. And that was done through creating what we call our Refugee Education Council, made up of youth, teachers, parents, community leaders, but all of them, what I think I would certainly consider youth. And if I reflect on our recent Together for Learning Summit that we held last week, virtually, unfortunately, it was a really important opportunity to bring those voices to the decision-making table. And throughout 2 days of virtual sessions, we had youth speaking in every single event and heard very powerful stories and very clear articulation of what they needed. And that was reflected in the delivery of a youth manifesto that was presented to ministers at the summit. And at that, as part of that manifesto, the youth representatives at the summit and in the lead up to through a number of youth consultations underscore the importance of 5 core themes: inclusion, mental health and psychosocial support, digital learning, gender equality, and the last one being accountability. So as I said, bear with me, I was circling back to the dashboard and accountability, and that's really where it landed, and it speaks to the aim of this Charlevoix Funding Dashboard. But my point is that that message is so much more powerful and an important reminder of the importance of accountability when it's coming from those that we're aiming to support. And we certainly heard that loud and clear. So I think our proudest contribution that we think that this can make from Canada's perspective, but I know many around the table share this, is seeing this as a tool for accountability. We know that it's specific to the Charlevoix initiative. We think that it's got some fantastic information, not just showing that we were able to do this and we were able to make commitments, but we're actually also to make those commitments in areas that make a difference in the lives of adolescents, of young women, of women for lifelong learning, for refugees and IDPs. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that this morning. We know that there have been an incredible number of projects that have been supported throughout this. We're hoping that we can look at both those results and also looking at this as a tool for how we can continue to hold each other accountable and how we can make sure that we're accountable again to those that we are really aiming to serve. So on that, I'd like to thank everybody for all of the collective work that went into making this happen, for G7 partners and beyond, the World Bank, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, the list goes on. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and insights from all the panelists and the participants as we look at these important trends in girls' education funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, but both for those insightful words and for Global Affairs Canada's partnership on this project. It's been really exciting to be able to work on a project that really supports transparency and accountability in these big global commitments. So let's dive into the dashboard. As I said, the Charlevoix Funding Dashboard was developed in order to promote transparency and accountability towards the commitments made by G7 countries and funding partners towards the 2018 Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education. The Charlevoix commitments truly were a milestone in generating attention and funding for girls' education in humanitarian and development contexts. And we're really thrilled to be able to show how, through the dashboard, how that funding is supporting girls' education around the world. The dashboard is the only place that consolidates data on Charlevoix funding to girls' education. It visualizes funding pledged and disbursed in support of the declaration and illustrates funding flows from donors and funding partners to regions, countries, and implementing partners. As you'll see in a moment, it also includes information on project focus areas, population groups served, and highlighted projects. Ultimately, the dashboard provides a picture of what has been achieved as a result of these historic commitments. The dashboard was developed in collaboration with the INEE Reference Group on Girls' Education and Emergencies. Data was collected and visualized by Informed International, and support for the dashboard was provided by Global Affairs Canada. So let's talk a little bit about how the dashboard was developed. So initial consultations were held with the reference group in early 2021 to determine the dashboard focus and structure, but also to understand what data we would really be able to collect on the commitments. Based on this information, Informed International then moved forward with data collection using a form which asked Charlevoix donors and funding partners to provide information on projects funded as a result of their Charlevoix pledges. All of the data and project information included in the dashboard were self-reported by Charlevoix donors and funding partners according to their own tracking of their pledges and expenditure. The level of project detail provided varied from donor to donor, but we've done our best to capture what data partners were able to share. Informed International then used this information to create an initial draft of the dashboard, which was then refined with the reference group through an iterative process of consultations and surveys. Once the final data and visualizations were agreed upon, implementing partners were then asked to review and validate their project data. And that was coordinated either directly through their donor agency or through INAE. Feedback was then incorporated by the consultant team and the data set was sent for translation. The dashboard is now being launched in English, but we're excited to say that it will soon be available in Arabic, French, and Spanish as well. So before we jump into what the dashboard does and doesn't show, what it does and doesn't do, let's take a moment to explore the dashboard and learn how to navigate it, guided by my former colleague, Laura Davison.
Navigate to the dashboard by clicking the image on the INAE dashboard web page. This will open a separate link. Scroll down to click the full screen button at the bottom of the page to best view the dashboard. The dashboard is organized into 6 pages which visualize the data in different ways. In this video, I will walk you through each of the pages. On the home page, which we are currently viewing, you will find information on the overall funding pledged and disbursed by donors, as well as information on how to navigate and use this dashboard. You will also find information specific to individual donors' disbursements. And you will find a link to the original Charlevoix Declaration on the top left of the page, which will open a separate link. The funding distribution page illustrates the flow of funding from donor agency to projects. You can filter by region, country, donor, and implementing partner. This feature is available on all dashboard pages. So, for example, if I wanted to find out about the funding Canada has disbursed, I would select Canada from the drop-down menu under Donors. I can then select the dimensions I'm most interested in, whether that be the regions, countries, implementers, or types of organizations that Canadian funding is supporting. You can make individual or multiple selections in any of the drop-down menus at the top of the page and then select the dimensions you wish to see. We also encourage you to read the explanations at the top of each page for information on the data and on how to navigate the page. The Project Focus page is a tree map that represents the amount of funding allocated to different project focus areas. The size of the boxes proportionally represents the amount of funding going to each focus area. You can hover over individual boxes to see which project is represented by that box. On this page, you can also filter by primary, secondary, or tertiary project focus area. This represents the project focus areas donors selected to describe the projects they are funding in order of relevance. So, for instance, on this page, I have already selected the United Kingdom, and I can see that learning outcomes is an important primary focus for many of their projects. The demographics page presents 2 bar graphs. The graph on the top shows which education levels are targeted by projects, and the graph below shows which population groups are supported by projects. The bars show the percentage of all projects that reported supporting those education levels and population groups, and multiple could be selected. So on this page, looking at all of the Charlevoix funding, we can see that 86% of projects reported serving primary education and 66% of projects reported targeting host populations. The countries page presents where the projects are located, shaded by the amount of funding allocated per country. The darker the color, the more funding a country is receiving. Below the map is where you can find the most detailed information on every project in this dashboard. You can also zoom into the map to select a specific country. This will filter the table at the bottom of the page to data specifically for that country. Finally, the Project Highlights page presents projects donors have chosen to highlight with more detail. You can hover over a point on the map to learn more about the project. In the pop-up box, select Click here for more information to open an external website with more detail on that project. We hope you enjoy using the dashboard and finding out more about how, where, and in what way the Charlevoix funding for girls and women's education is being used.
Thanks, Laura. So now that we've seen how to navigate the dashboard, here are a few limitations and lessons learned that we'd like to share. So the first up is the timeline. So many Charlevoix pledges were planned to be expended over a period of several years. Due to data availability at the time that the dashboard was developed, this dashboard includes data from June 2018 through December 2020. One exception to that is Global Affairs Canada's data, which goes through the end of March 2021 as a result of their fiscal year. It's also important to note which funding is and isn't included in the dashboard. So the dashboard only captures the funding pledged and dispersed against the Charlevoix Declaration. It does not include all funding to girls' education. But if you'd like to learn more about wider girls' education funding and initiatives from these donors and funding partners, we'd recommend you check out the dashboard landing page for some helpful links, and you should be able to find that link in the chat. Another point is on how to use the dashboard. So Charlevoix pledges were made and disbursements were tracked by donors and funding partners in some really different ways. Some donors made broad commitments and dispersed funding directly to a variety of implementing partners. Others made commitments specifically to multilaterals, which then made funding decisions of their own. And others still made commitments to reach a set number of girls rather than making a specific financial commitment. It's unsurprising then that these commitments were tracked in different ways. As a result, it's important to know that these data are not comparable. The goal of the dashboard is not to compare donors, but rather to show how the pledges were realized and what types of programs and stakeholders were supported by this funding. On a related note, since gender responsive programming approaches vary, so too do the programs represented in the dashboard. Some projects exclusively target female learners, others support girls and boys, but have a focus on gender equity and addressing gendered barriers to learning. But all of the projects included support and promote gender responsive education in some way. So I've shared a bit about what the dashboard doesn't show, but what does it show? It shows that by the end of 2020, Charlevoix donors had dispersed over $4 billion US, which have supported over 500 projects through over 320 implementing partners in over 100 countries around the world. By the end of 2020, all Charlevoix donors had either already met or were on track to meet their pledges. And it's worth noting that while it's not captured in the dashboard, many donors and funding partners have since dispersed significant additional funding above and beyond their commitments, particularly related to support during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Charlevoix Declaration made some really bold commitments to support girls' education holistically across the humanitarian development nexus and from early childhood education through TVET and higher education. While some populations, education levels, or focus areas are receiving more funding than others, ultimately all of the aspects highlighted in the declaration are being supported by this funding in some way. Of course, this is not to say that additional funding isn't needed. We still have a long way to go before every girl's right to quality, safe, and inclusive education is met, and more targeted long-term funding will be needed to make that a reality. But this dashboard does show that Charlevoix donors and funding partners have honored the commitments that they made in support of the Charlevoix Declaration, and that those commitments are supporting girls and boys around the world and slowly moving the needle. So I'll hand over now to I&E's director, Dean Brooks, who will be moderating a panel discussion on funding and advocacy for girls' education. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Very excited to be launching the Charlevoix Funding Dashboard today, a tool which we hope will help provide transparency in the commitments made in support of the Charlevoix Declaration. So at this time, we're going to turn to our high-level panel, who will share their insights on girls' education funding and advocacy more broadly. We're grateful to have an incredible group of panelists with us today. I hope you'll join me in welcoming them. So our first panelist and our first question is for Angela Matronessa, the head of regional influencing and strategic communications in Eastern, Southern Africa, and the Middle East for Plan International. Angela, can you tell us why initiatives like the Charlevoix Funding Dashboard, which make funding pledged and dispersed towards international commitments transparent, are important? And what are civil society's asks around funding for girls' education in emergencies moving forward? Over to you, Angela.
Thank you very much, Dean, and massive congratulations for the launch of the funding dashboard. We are really happy as an institution that we've been part of this journey, and we've seen the remarkable strides and results that it is yielding in the lives of girls. The entire world, as you know, is facing an education emergency, and there is a huge need for provision of quality education for all girls that are in crisis-affected countries. So this dashboard could not have come at a better time. Allow me quickly to applaud the Global Affairs Canada for their funding projects through us in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria. Indeed, we are already starting to see the significant gains around education. And we also appreciate their leadership in championing this Charlevoix agenda and ensuring political commitment to closing the gaps on education for girls in crisis. So resource tracking is very critical. You can't measure or you can't manage what you can't measure. This funding dashboard will go a long way in ensuring crucial, effective coordination among aid stakeholders. It will help develop a shared understanding of needs, as well as avoid duplicating of efforts. As Lauren was speaking, I could tell that there could be a lot of duplication of efforts across donors, but this dashboard will help minimize that. It will also identify and cover important gaps in education responses so that we reach the most marginalized girls. It will also provide that coherent and sustainable responses. As we sit today, girls in Torit of Juba are going without food. Girls in Nampula of Mozambique have seen back-to-back cyclones that are going unabated. Girls in Tigray of Ethiopia or those in Mahara districts are also facing a lot of crises. Some of these are very small, now forgotten crises. This dashboard should be able to identify those forgotten crises and be able to respond. It will also go a long way to show us who is walking the talk to meet outcomes for girls. And it is an important outcome for our advocacy across countries. But what are civil society's asks around funding for girls in emergencies moving forward? We all know that the COVID crisis that is still amongst us pushed for a lot of closures and lockdowns for girls, and millions may never return to school. So my 4 critical asks are: number 1, make the investments matter and have impact. Education is the most underfunded area of humanitarian aid, with only around 3%, if not 4%, of global humanitarian funding allocated. Such aid remains still unpredictable and unevenly distributed. So we really would like to urge that if countries are cutting financing as an austerity measure, we will see a lot of damage to girls' education if this continues. Number 2, we have no room for complacency. Girls in emergencies cannot wait. So bureaucracies, cumbersome processes, slow turnover in fund allocations, despite the fact that they are coming in the dashboard projects that all money has come in, those slow turnovers are jeopardizing girls' futures. By the time money arrives in a lot of countries, girls are gone. They are married off, they are pregnant, or they are whisked away to work for their next meal. So just like the Charlevoix Declaration is clear on our responsibilities to help girls return to school, we need to ensure that there is real political commitment, agility, and rapid response to accelerate our impact. Thirdly, education emergencies actors must prepare to respond rapidly to crises and draw from local knowledge and expertise. There's a lot that is happening all together in communities. Let's listen to the girls themselves, but also let's listen to local practitioners. Fourthly, prioritize the teacher. Structural issues, inadequate training, poor compensation, and harsh environments are hindering the teacher's capacity to deliver in emergencies. So we are quite sad that in most of our reviews, the teacher who is responding in emergencies is poorly remunerated, despite working in overcrowded, unstable, and challenging contexts. 4, let's plug education in emergencies into broader development education work, just as in alignment with the commitments to our new ways of working or the Global Compact for Refugees. So we need to ensure that we are working closely with national governments and ensure that education plans and those in emergencies integrate resilience in our planning and response. And then finally, explore the purpose of schooling in a humanitarian context. So our response should go yonder from just responding to humanitarian context. We need to move beyond increasing access to school, but also ask ourselves, what kind or quality of education are we giving to the girls, to the young women in a context of emergency? They need education systems that respond to their needs, their circumstances. We should furthermore continue to invest in life skills and vocational education as best tools to the peace, to the stability, and to the economic recovery of fragile nations. We cannot wait anymore. We have already faced interruption to education, and our girls can no longer wait. Thank you very much, and I hope this dashboard will continue helping us to use evidence in our advocacy work. Thank you, Dean, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Angela, and for those important points on making the investment. Education cannot wait, as we know, and we need to make these political commitments for girls' education, the urgency of now, and really preparing to respond rapidly, listening to girls themselves and the communities, prioritizing teachers and a focus on quality. Such important points, a rich discussion. Appreciate your points, Angela. At this point time, our second question is for Pascale Grotenwee, the Ambassador for Gender Equality and Women's Rights for the Netherlands. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name, of course. Ambassador, how can evidence and data support better funding and better tracking of funding to girls in education and emergencies, as well as create momentum and engagement on girls' education?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I think Pascale is sufficient, so it's all good.
Thank you.
So let me start by thanking INNE and also our dear friend Louise, and also all those involved for organizing this event, and offer and join Angela in congratulating you on the launch of the Charlevoix, sorry, I have to pronounce it again, dashboard. And I also want to thank you, Angela, for making such important points. And also mentioning Mozambique in your speech, which is very close to my heart. So I think today is a really good moment for all of us to discuss the importance of girls' education and the crucial role that data and evidence play in optimizing our efforts towards creating a safe and inclusive learning environment for girls. And I think, Angela, you said it very clear. I think with the whole COVID pandemic, I think it's the momentum is there to even increase the efforts. I think, as you know, we are strongly committed to gender equality and women's rights, and every girl and woman has the right to learn. So therefore, education for girls and supporting gender transformative education systems are important parts of our current efforts. I firmly believe that investing in women and girls is the smartest investment any of us can make. It's an investment that works. Every additional year of schooling a girl completes increases her future earning by 10 to 20%. And these earnings will be mostly reinvested in their family and communities. In emergency settings, supporting access to education is crucial. It provides girls and boys with the necessary knowledge, skills, and tools to deal with, or break the cycle of violence and contribute to their community's recovery. And we just have to look at crises in Afghanistan or Ukraine just to see how vital education is for girls and boys. In particular, girls need education to take control of their own lives. An educated girl is better protected against gender-based risk, such as early marriage and pregnancy, as Angela raised as well, but also abuse and exploitation. But they also are better prepared to be able to make the right choices for herself and her society. We have to be smart about how we invest in and support girls' education. There are major inequalities and inefficiencies with regards to education funding, the way it's distributed, and the impact that is created. This is a luxury we cannot afford. Good coordination and preventing fragmentation is of the utmost importance. Naturally, reliable evidence and data should be the basis of all our policy making and funding, since we want to implement policies that work. However, availability of good quality data, especially in conflict-affected areas, has been persistently and critically lacking. And often it's not gender segregated, even though the needs, issues, and challenges at hand are most definitely gendered. That's why we're so happy with initiatives such as the Charlevoix Dashboard, because they are incredibly valuable since it creates transparency about donor funding and promotes accountability towards the commitment made. Domestic financing for education is of course key, and the Netherlands applauds the initiative of His Excellency President Kenyatta of Kenya in July 2021 to call on his fellow heads of state and governments to action and to make a joint commitment. And so far, about 20 GPE partner countries have pledged to increase their domestic education expenditure towards the global benchmark of 20% of the annual total public expenditure. To be very honest, and to look at ourselves as the Netherlands, I don't think we will have the 20%, but maybe I'm mistaken. So it's a good call for action to us as well. Data and evidence are not only important for funding and policy, they also have value in creating a shared understanding of the issues at hand. And in my role as ambassador for women's rights and gender equality, this evidence is of huge value in strengthening my message and making my case, why we need to invest in women and girls, why we need to take action now. And then it comes to realization. It's not only about the facts and figures, but I know that you all have a great sense about that, because the facts and figures are linked to real people, and they become more powerful when they support the stories of actual women and girls who themselves can tell us about their personal experiences, their aspirations, their ambitions, and also their needs. So it's crucial that we talk and cooperate with young people. And Louise, I was very grateful for you mentioning it already in your introduction, because young people can provide us with an understanding of their lives and their experiences, which statistics on their own would find hard to match. Besides this, we also should enable young people to help shape the future of their countries and communities and save them a seat at the table at which decisions that affect them are being made. It's important to have both, to have the stories of the girls and boys about their dreams and their needs. And we need to have the statistics to show it's not a story on itself, but it actually represents the stories of many other young women and girls. So it's really important that showing the reality girls in emergency settings they live in through data as well as by listening to the girls affected, it allows for the start of an important conversation, a discussion, and it helps to create international engagement. Because only together we can work towards a safer, more equal future in which every child, no matter their gender or their location, can fulfill their right to education. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and really important points you've raised about this momentum underway, that this is one of the smartest investments that can be made to support girls' education in emergencies. Especially appreciated the highlight you made on how education for girls also has a protective factor, and something very important for the I&E community is linking closely with our child protection colleagues, and the link between education and protection, the importance of good coordination, and this represents that. Thank you for raising these points. You know, we really hope that the Charlevoix Funding Dashboard will help contribute to this transparent tracking of the commitments. And also I would like to mention I&E is contributing to the evidence base for girls' education in emergencies through the Mind the Gap reports. Many of you have seen the first report, and I'm happy to share that the second edition will be launching soon, so you will want to watch for that. So turning now to our next panelist, Raja Bentois Katan, who is the advisor to the Education Global Practice and Global Lead for Gender for the World Bank. Raja, can you tell us how COVID-19 has affected funding for girls' education in emergencies? And what lessons have been learned from COVID-19? And how will they impact future funding for girls' education in emergencies? Over to you, Raja.
Thank you. Well, first, maybe just to set back, provide a bit of context on what we're doing, and then address your question. First, I'd really like to thank Lauren and the I&E team really for hosting this event, and huge congrats really for this critical and important work. As Angela and Pascal mentioned, this dashboard is really critical for tracking and providing accountability of funding. The World Bank feels that the Charlevoix Declaration, as Louise earlier mentioned, represents a real important milestone for coordinating efforts on girls' education in fragile conflict and violent settings, for which the World Bank has placed a huge importance, and not only has met the commitment, but has surpassed the goal of the $2 billion target. And I think having this dashboard has been able to indicate what different partners have been able to commit to girls' education. Ensuring that girls and young women receive a quality education is a strategic development priority for the World Bank. As the largest financing development partner in education, the World Bank supports inclusion of gender elements into all of its education projects in order to overcome barriers that are preventing girls from equally benefiting from education. For girls and young women in FCV contexts, which is actually a context that I hold really close to my heart because I've worked in several FCV countries where I've seen this firsthand. Actually, my previous role before joining the global unit was in Yemen as a country manager for Yemen, and then previously in Haiti and in West Africa. So how I've seen how in these type of settings, the situation is even more critical. And we've seen with estimates that girls in these settings are almost 2.5 times more likely to be out of school, and young women are nearly 90% more likely to be out of secondary school than their counterparts in countries that are not affected by by conflict. And now with adding COVID-19, it really, the situation is even more dire. Just in terms of context, for the World Bank portfolio, we have 170 active projects across 90 countries with an estimate total spending of $11.4 billion, impacting over 150 million girls in all stages of the education cycle. Out of this portfolio, 1/4 is in FCB context. And now what we've seen is that with the COVID-19, even though we have seen improvement over the past few decades, we all know that the closures are putting all that progress at risk. And as I mentioned earlier, the girls are in even more serious situations. The girls we're seeing now with some initial surveys that we've done at the bank, your question about how COVID-19 has affected, girls are facing multiple challenges when trying to return to school, including catching up to lack of learning, higher risk of dropouts due to early marriage and pregnancy, and increased share of household tasks. For example, a survey in Bangladesh shows that 53% of girls reported spending less time on education than before COVID, and 93%, that's an alarmingly high number, report more time spent on household chores and childcare. With girls being so vulnerable already in many places where are reluctantly sent to schools, additional pressure on families who are already struggling may have significant impacts. And we have seen that with this, even with for example, with other crises like the Ebola in West Africa. So what we're doing is trying to address this issue by supporting a lot of operations that are focusing on getting girls back into school and ensuring a more holistic, multi-pronged approach to support their education. And we have, for example, projects have responded very quickly, for example, in Chad, in Sudan, and in Ethiopia, Pakistan. And what we've seen is these projects include a variety of interventions, from advocacy campaigns to get girls back in school, into specialized learning materials for girls that are falling behind, and also campaigns to combat gender-based violence, which we have seen has rise during the pandemic closures. Now, the pandemic will also, what we've learned is that it's going to also push a further 40 to 60 million people into extreme poverty, and most of the disadvantaged children are at the highest risk of dropping out. Now, when you ask about the question about how this will impact funding, we've seen that donors are already, and I think Angela alluded to this, and so did Pascal, are already struggling to maintain their current levels of assistance. And FCV countries will be particularly affected, as the major chunk of their education funding is dependent on foreign aid. This comes at a time when the need will even be greater, given that education budgets, especially in low and lower middle income countries, are not adjusting proportionally to the challenges brought by COVID. Despite additional funding needs, 2/3 of low and lower middle income countries have in fact cut their public education budgets since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, with health sector taking the majority of the funding. We know that those in the most vulnerable position will feel the crunch the most. And what we've learned is that the pandemic has already exacerbated the challenge to the safe learning environment for girls. Actually, the World Bank just launched our strategy paper on safe learning in the midst of fragility, conflict, and violence just last month. Actually, we launched it, which really takes a deep dive into how we can do responsive education programming for children to have a safe learning experience in the midst of conflict and crisis, with the hope of convincing ministers of finance that it's now is the time, and where education really plays a critical role in addressing the inequalities that underpin gender disparities in these contexts. From COVID-19, we have learned lessons about what needs to be done to help all students, and especially the most vulnerable. Key priorities for learning recovery include bringing the girls and boys back to school, measuring learning, consolidating the curriculum, and increasing the efficiency and duration of instructional time, providing psychosocial and socio-emotional support, especially those in the more vulnerable situations like girls in FCB context. Lastly, while the Charlevoix Declaration is still an ongoing commitment through 2023, we're extremely thankful to INE for leading this important work to demonstrate and track our commitments to girls in FCB settings. This is a way for us to show donors to put money where, as they say in English, to put the money where their mouth is, or where, yeah. And we hope to continue working with many of our donors and partners, including those in this panel, to further advance equity in education and continue to serve the children in some of the most challenging contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raja, and these important points and sobering comments on the realities that exist at the moment for girls' education and how COVID is affecting this. And I just want to say, personally, thank you to Canada for making this a reality. I'm sitting here in Honduras speaking with you, and it was a couple years back. I remember having to go to the Canadian Embassy and discuss, and we had this idea of a dashboard and an amazing team at INE who made it a reality, Laura and Lauren and Sumbal and everybody on the INE Secretariat. But it's just amazing to be here today and to see visually what can happen and seeing how the donors have all come together to make this a reality. And we really believe this is an opportunity to build more transparency into all areas, and especially girls' education in emergencies. At this time, I'm really happy to welcome Chris Berry for our final question. Chris Berry is the Senior Education Advisor for the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. Chris, what do you see as the future of funding for girls' education in emergencies? What are the challenges or opportunities of advocating for that future? And how is the girls' education and emergency landscape now different than it was in 2018 when the Charlevoix Declaration was developed? Chris, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Hello, everybody. I thought I'd put some slides together. And it's always difficult to go last because you kind of feel like everything's been said by all those excellent speakers before me. So yeah, those were the three questions. So we've got 3 slides here. I'd also like to start by thanking INEE and Global Affairs Canada for this initiative, which I think has been important, not least in showing how difficult it is to kind of get a handle on this question of donor funding in this space. But I think we've made progress in terms of trying to unpack that in this exercise. So thanks for that. So in terms of kind of the funding, where funding can come from. Well, I guess I'd like to start with domestic financing. There was a useful graph in the last Mind the Gap report, which showed how far countries are from the Untitled Declaration 20% target, which is what is in number 1 there. And this is for FCAS countries. And at the end of the day, the bulk of finance for education is domestic. And if we're trying to build more resilient education systems, that does require financing that comes from the governments that we're working with. So that's the biggest source of funding. I think the second point would be, I think one of the speakers mentioned humanitarian funding for education, and it is around 3% now. We don't think it's ever going to be where the money is for education in crisis. That what we need to try and do is leverage reliable multi-year financing. So it looks more like development funding actually, and in many cases is development funding. I mean, the bank have spoken. We work very closely with the bank in the Syria crisis. A lot of the finance, it was development finance that came in to support refugee education in some of the countries that were affected, Lebanon or Jordan. So, you know, that's where I think some of the big money is going to come from. Humanitarian funding, we're always going to struggle to make the case for education. And the funding itself is suboptimal for education objectives, which are multi-year objectives. I think we'd like to see a fully resourced education cannot wait. They've got a big replenishment event coming up for the next strategic plan. So I think that's part of the picture. And then better improved coordination and delivery of support across partners. This is on the international side. So we've got GPE, who increasingly fund FCAS. We've got UNICEF, we've got UNHCR, we've got Education Cannot Wait. I've not got the bank on that slide, but clearly an important partner too. And the bilaterals, of course, as well. But we were just focusing there on the on some of the institutions that in the global international architecture are important for delivering on education and emergencies. Thanks, Lauren. Next slide, please. So what are the opportunities? Well, I think ironically, one of the opportunities is that we've had so many crises recently, and Ukraine, you know, we're all right in the middle of that right now. And that these have increased, and COVID, on the back of COVID. I think these have increasingly shown all of us why education really matters in a crisis. It really came home to people in the UK during COVID why we send our kids to school, actually, and the value of sending kids to school, not only for learning, but also from a protection point of view. And these, you know, the crises are becoming more frequent, and we're seeing larger and larger numbers of children displaced. Part of that is driven by climate change and climate change related events. So this is a problem that's not going away, and there's an opportunity in there, I think, to find ways to do better than perhaps we have done, although we've made big strides to do better than we have done on education in those circumstances. That's about the challenges. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, the challenges vary by context. I've just quickly put down a few thoughts on Afghanistan here, where, you know, we all of us are working at the minute. So there's obviously a very big need across sectors beyond education. Humanitarian crisis is massive there. Funding for education has fallen off a cliff, as it says there, post the regime change. It's politically difficult to work in Afghanistan. The politics are really difficult when you've got girls not being allowed into secondary school. What do? You know, it's just a practical question of how to work in those environments. And implementation is difficult. You know, it's not entirely safe still. The capacity on the ground isn't necessarily there to deliver. And getting scale, if you're working outside of government, is really challenging to reach any kind of scale and reach. So yeah, that's Afghanistan challenge. We could pick another country and talk through the challenge there, and it might look a bit different. Thanks, Lauren. Next slide. So what's different between now and 2018? We had a bit of a conversation internally about this. 2018 isn't that long ago, is it? I mean, we're only in 2022 now. So I guess we came up with three. It'd be really interesting to see what others thought. But so one thing, you know, the ECW is now more mature. It's got more of a track record. I think it's more of a recognized vehicle for delivering in crisis. So that is different. You know, it existed in 2018, but it is a bit more mature now. I think there's more awareness of the growing and around the growing number and scale of crises and the importance, as I've already said, of education within that. So I think we have moved on in terms of seeing education as a core part of the response. I think we're still working through how that looks in practice, but definitely have learned a lot of lessons. And then just I think just point to the recent G7 global goals on girls' education, which very much built on Charlevoix, where we've got these goals now of 40 million more girls in education and 20 million more reading by the age of 10. So we've got some hard targets, which is is something we can aim for, and also it gives us a hook. I think to be honest, I think you could achieve these without doing anything for conflict and crisis affected girls, but you would be incredibly disingenuous if you did that, because actually these are some of the most vulnerable groups. So I think it's key that we deliver for those girls affected by conflict and crisis within these targets. And I think I'm pushing on an open door when I say that. Thanks, Lauren.
Chris, thank you so much. These important points that you've raised, the highlights, the changes that we've seen since Charlevoix, an important message that you've given us that the education goals will not be met unless we act. And appreciate you taking time to talk with us today. I believe we're close to time, so you will see in the chat an email address if you have any follow-up questions. Girls Education, all one word, at inee.org. And at this time, I would just like to thank our esteemed panelists for the important contributions you made today. This is an exciting milestone that we have reached, and I encourage you to share with all of you on the call. I encourage you to share the funding dashboard with your colleagues and reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you again, and I'll hand back to Lauren for the closing.
Thanks, Dean. I also really just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers and to everyone who joined us today. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to learn about the dashboard and discuss trends in funding for girls' education and emergencies. Please do check out the dashboard on our website, and the link is in the chat again. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at girlseducation@inee.org. Thanks again, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from you all. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.